On July 16, 1923, I moved into Exham Priory after the last workman had finished his labors. The restoration had been a stupendous task, for little had remained of the deserted pile but a shell-like ruin. Yet because it had been the seat of my ancestors, I let no expense deter me. The place had not been inhabited since the reign of James I, when a tragedy of intensely hideous, though largely unexplained, nature had struck down the master, 5 of his children, and several servants. And driven forth under a cloud of suspicion and terror, the third son. My lineal progenitor and my only survivor of the abhorred line. With this sole heir, denounced as a murderer, the estate had reverted to the crown, nor had the accused man made any attempt to exculpate himself or regain his property. Shaken by some horror greater than that of the conscience or the law, and expressing only a frantic wish to exclude the ancient edifice from his sight and memory, Walter de la Poe, 11th Baron Exham, fled to Virginia and there founded the family which by the next century had become known as Delapoer. Exham Priory had remained untenanted, though later allotted to the estates of the Norris family, and much studied because of its peculiarity composite architecture, an architecture involving Gothic towers resting on a Saxon or Romanesque substructure, whose foundation in turn was of a still earlier order or blend of orders, Roman and even Druidic or native Cymric, if legends speak truly. This foundation was a very singular thing, being merged on one side with a solid limestone on the precipice, from whose brink the priory overlooked a desolate valley 3 miles west of the village of Anchester. Architects and antiquarians loved to examine this strange relic of forgotten centuries, but the country folk hated it. They had hated it hundreds of years before when my ancestors had lived there, and they hated it now with the moss and mold of abandonment on it. I had not been a day in Anchester before I knew I came of an accursed house. In this week, workmen had blown up Exham Priory and are busy obliterating the trace of its foundations. The bare statistics of my ancestry I had always known, together with the fact that my first American forebear had come to the colonies under a strange cloud. Of details, however, I have been kept wholly ignorant through the policy of reticence always maintained by the Delapoers. Unlike our planter neighbors, we seldom boasted of crusading ancestors and of other medieval and Renaissance heroes, nor was any kind of tradition handed down except what may have been recorded in the sealed envelope left before the Civil War by every squire to his eldest son for posthumous opening. The glories we cherished were those achieved since the migration, the glories of a proud and honorable, somewhat reserved and unsocial Virginia line. During the war, our fortunes were extinguished and our whole existence changed by the burning of Carfax, our home on the banks of the James. My grandfather, in advancing years, had perished in that incendiary outrage, and with him the envelope that bound us all to the past. I recall that fire today as I saw it then at the age of 7, with the Federal soldiers shouting, the women screaming, and the Negroes howling and praying. My father was in the army, defending Richmond, and after many formalities, my mother and I passed through the lines to join him. When the war ended, we all moved north, whence my mother had come, and I grew to manhood, middle age, and ultimate wealth as a stolid Yankee. Neither my father nor I ever knew what hereditary envelope had it contained, and I merged into the greyness of Massachusetts business life. I lost all interest in the mysteries which evidently lurked far back in my family tree. Had I suspected their nature, how gladly I would have left Exham Priory to its moss, vast, and cobwebs. My father died in 1904, but without any message to leave me or to my only child, Alfred, a motherless boy of 10. It was this boy who reversed the order of the family information, for although I could give him only jesting conjectures about the past, he wrote me of some very interesting ancestral legends when the late war took him to England in 1917 as an aviation officer. Apparently, the Delaports had a colorful and perhaps sinister history, for a friend of my son's, Captain Edward Norreys of the Royal Flying Corps, dealt near the family seat at Anchester and related some peasant superstitions which few novelists could equal for wildness and incredibility. Norreys himself, of course, did not take them seriously, but they amused my son and made good material for his letters to me. It was this legendary which definitely turned my attention to the transatlantic heritage, and made me resolve to purchase and restore the family seat which Norreys showed to Alfred in its picturesque desertion, and offered to get it for him at a surprisingly reasonable figure, since his own uncle was the present owner. I bought Exham Priory in 1918, but was almost immediately distracted from my plans of restoration by the return of my son as a maimed invalid. During the 2 years that he lived, I thought of nothing but his care, having even placed my business under the direction of partners. In 1921, as I found myself bereaved and aimless, a retired manufacturer no longer young, I resolved to divert my remaining years with my new profession. Visiting Anchester in December, I was entertained by Captain Norris, a plump, amiable young man who had thought much of my son and secured his assistance in gathering plans and anecdotes to guide in the coming restoration. Exham Priory itself I saw without emotion, a jumble of tottering medieval ruins, covered with lichens and honeycombed with rooks' nests, perched perilously upon a precipice, and denuded of floors or other interior features save the stone walls of the separate towers. As I gradually recovered the image of the edifice as it had been when my ancestor left it over 3 centuries before, I began to hire workmen for the reconstruction. In every case, I was forced to go outside of the immediate locality, for the Anchester villagers had an almost unbelievable fear and hatred of the place. This sentiment was so great that it was sometimes communicated to the outside laborers, causing numerous desertions, whilst its scope appeared to include both the priory and its ancient family. My son had told me that he was somewhat avoided during his visits because he was a Delapoe, and I now found myself subtly ostracized for a like reason, until I convinced the peasants how little I knew of my heritage. Even then they solemnly disliked me, so that I had to collect most of the village traditions through the mediation of Norreys. What the people could not forgive, perhaps, was that as I come to restore a symbol so abhorrent to them, for rationally or not, they viewed Exham Priory as nothing less than a haunt of fiends and werewolves. piecing together the tales which Nori collected for me, and supplementing them with the accounts of several savants who had studied the ruins, I deduced that Exum Priority stood on the site of a prehistoric temple, a druidical or anti-druidical thing, which must have been contemporary with Stonehenge. That indescribable rites had been celebrated there, few doubted, and they were unpleasant tales of the transference of these rites into the Sibylle worship which the Romans had introduced. Inscriptions still visible in the subcellar bore such unmistakable letters as Div, Divops, Magna, Mat, sign of the Magna Mater, whose dark worship was once vainly forbidden to Roman citizens. Anchester had been the camp of the 3rd Augustan Legion, as many remains attest, and it was said that the temple of Sibylle was splendid and thronged with worshippers who performed nameless ceremonies at the bidding of Phrygian priest. Tales added that the fall of the old religion did not end the orgies at the temple, but the priests lived on in the new faith without real change. Likewise, it was said the rites did not vanish with the Roman power, and that certain among the Saxons added to what remained of the temple, and gave it the essential outline it subsequently preserved, making it the center of a cult feared through half the heptarchy. About 1000 AD, the place is mentioned in a chronicle as being a substantial stone priory, housing a strange and powerful monastic order, and surrounded by extensive gardens which need no walls to exclude a frightened populace. It was never destroyed by the Danes, though after the Norman conquest it must have been declined tremendously, since there was no impediment when Henry III granted the site to my ancestor Gilbert de la Poe, 1st Baron Exum in 1261. Of my family before this date there is no evil report, but something strange must have happened to them. In one chronicle there is a reference to a de la Poe as a, quote, cursed of God, unquote, in 1307, whilst village legendary had nothing but evil and frantic fear to tell of the castle that went up on the foundations of the old temple and priory. The fireside tales were of the most grisly description, all the ghastlier because of their frightened reticence and cloudy evasiveness. They represented my ancestors as a race of hereditary demons, beside whom Gilles de Retz and the Marquis de Sade, it seemed various tyros, and hinted whisperingly at their responsibility for the occasional disappearances of villagers through several generations. The worst characters, apparently, were the barons and the direct heirs, at least most whispered about these. If of healthier inclinations, it was said an heir would early and mysteriously die to make way for a more typical heir, scion. There seemed to be an inner cult in the family, presided over by the head of the house and sometimes closed except to a few members. Temperament, rather than ancestry, was evidently the basis of this cult, for it was entered by several of them who married in the family. Lady Margaret Trevor of Cornwall, wife of Godfrey, the second son of the fifth Baron, became a fifth favorite of Bane of children all over the countryside, and the demon heroine of a particularly horrible old ballad, not yet extinct over near the Welsh border. Preserved in balladry too, though not illustrating the same point, is the hideous tale of Lady Mary de la Poe, who shortly after her marriage to the Earl of Shrewsfield was killed by him and his mother, both the slayers being absolved and blessed by the priest, to whom they confessed what they dared not repeat to the world. These myths and ballads, typical as they were of crude superstition, repelled me greatly. Their persistence and their application to so long a line of ancestors were especially annoying, whilst the imitations of monstrous habits proved unpleasantly reminiscent of one known scandal of my immediate forebears. The case of my cousin, young Randolph Delapour of Carfax, who went among the Negroes and became a voodoo priest after he returned from the Mexican War. I was much less disturbed by the vaguer tales of wails and howlings in the barren, windswept valley beneath this limestone cliff, of the graveyard stenches after the spring rains, of the floundering, squealing white thing on which Sir John Clave's horse had trodden one night in the lonely field, and the servant who had gone mad at what he saw in the priory in the full light of day. These things were hackneyed, special lore, and I was at that time a pronounced skeptic. The accounts of vanished peasants was less to be dismissed, though not especially significant in view of the medieval custom. Prying curiosity meant death, and more than one severed head had been publicly shown from the bastions, now effaced, around Exham Priory. A few of the tales were exceedingly picturesque and made me wish I had learned more of a comparative mythology in my youth. There was, for instance, the belief that a legion of bat-winged devils kept witches' Sabbath each night at the Priory, a legion of whose sustenance might explain the disproportionate abundance of coarse vegetables harvested in vast gardens. And most visibly of all, there was the dramatic epic of rats, the scampering army of obscene vermin which had burst forth from the castle 3 months after the tragedy that doomed it to desertion. The lean, filthy, ravenous army which had swept all before and devoured fowl, cats, dogs, hogs, sheep, and even 2 hapless human beings before its fury was spent. Around that unforgettable rodent army a whole separate cycle of myths revolves, for it scattered among the village homes and brought curses and horrors in its train. Such was the lure that assailed me as I pushed to completion, with an elderly obstinacy, the work of restoring my ancestral home. It must not be imagined for a moment that these tales formed my principal psychological environment. On the other hand, I was constantly praised and encouraged by Captain Norris and the antiquarians who surrounded and aided me. task was done over 2 years after its commencement. I reviewed the great room's wainscot walls years after its commencement, vaulted ceilings, mullioned windows, and broad staircases with a pride with which fully compensated for the prodigious expense of the restoration. Every attribute in the Middle Ages was cunningly reproduced, and the new parts blended perfectly with the original walls and foundations. The seat of my fathers was complete, and I looked forward to redeeming at last the local fame of the line which ended in me. I will reside here permanently, and prove that a de la Poe, for I had adopted again the original spelling of the name, need not be a fiend. My comfort was perhaps augmented by the fact that although Exon Priory was medievally fitted, its interior was in truth wholly new and free from old vermin and old ghosts alike. As I have said, I moved in on July 16th, 1923. My household consisted of 7 servants and 9 cats, of which species I am particularly fond. My eldest cat, Nigger Man, was 7 years old and had come with me from my home in Bolton, Massachusetts. The others I had accumulated while living with Captain Norris' family during the restoration of the priory. For 5 days our routine proceeded with the utmost placidity, my time being mostly spent in the codification of old family data. I now obtained some very circumstantial accounts of the final tragedy and flight of Walter de la Poe, which I conceded to be the probable contents of the hereditary paper lost in the fire at Carfax. It appeared that my ancestor was accused with much reason of having killed all the other members of his household, except 4 servant confederates in their sleep. About 2 weeks after a shocking discovery which changed his whole demeanor, but which, except by implication, he disclosed to no one save perhaps the servants who assisted him and afterward fled beyond reach. This deliberate slaughter, which included a father, 3 brothers, and 2 sisters, was largely condoned by the villagers and so slackly treated by the law that its perpetrator escaped honored, unharmed, and undisguised to Virginia, the general whispered sentiment being that he had purged the land of immemorial curse. What discovery had prompted an act so terrible I could scarcely even conjecture. Walter de la Poe must have known for years the sinister tales about his family, so that this material could have given him no fresh impulse. Had he then witnessed some appalling ancient rite or stumbled upon some frightful and revealing symbol in the priory or its vicinity? He was reputed to have been a shy, gentle youth in England. In Virginia he seemed not so much hard or bitter as harassed and apprehensive. He was spoken of in the diary of another gentleman adventurer, Francis Harley of Bellevue, as a man of unexampled justice, honor, and delicacy. On July 22nd occurred the first incident which, though lightly dismissed at the time, takes on preternatural significance in relation to later events. It was so simple as to be almost negligible, and could not possibly have been noticed under the circumstances, for it must be recalled that I was in a building practically fresh and new except for the walls, and surrounded by a well-balanced staff of servitors. Apprehension would have been absurd despite the locality. What I remember afterward is merely this: that my old cat, my old black cat, whose moods I know so well, was undoubtedly alert and anxious to an extent wholly out of keeping with his natural character. He roved from room to room, restless and disturbed, and sniffed constantly about the walls which formed part of the whole old Gothic structure. I realize how trite this sounds, like the inevitable dog in the ghost story, which always growls before his master sees the sheeted figure. Yet I cannot consistently suppress it. The following day, a servant complained of restlessness among all the cats in the house. He came to me in my study, a lofty west room in the second story, with groined arches, black oak paneling, and a triple Gothic window overlooking the limestone cliff and desolate valley. And even as he spoke, I saw the jetty form of Nigger Man creeping along the west wall and scratching at the new panels which overlaid the ancient stone. I told the man that there must be some singular odor or emanation from the old stonework, imperceptible to human senses, but affecting the delicate organs of cats even though through the new woodwork. This I truly believed, and when fellow suggested the presence of mice or rats, I mentioned that there must have been no rats there for 300 years, and that even the field mice of the surrounding country could hardly be found in these high walls, where they had never been known to stray. That afternoon I called on Captain Norris, and he assured me that it would be quite incredible for field mice to infest the Priory in such a sudden and unprecedented fashion. That night, dispensing as usual with the valet, I retired in the west tower chamber which I had chosen as my own, reached from the study by a stone staircase and short gallery, the former partly ancient and the latter entirely restored. This room was circular, very high, and without wainscoting, being hung with arras, which I had myself chosen in London. Seeing that Nigger Man was with me, I shut the heavy Gothic door and retired by the light of the electric bulbs, which so cleverly counterfeited candles. Finally, switching off the light and sinking on the carved and canopied four-poster with the venerable cat in his accustomed place. Across my feet. I did not draw the curtains, but gazed out at the narrow north wall window which I faced. There was a suspicion of aurora in the sky, and the delicate traceries of the window were pleasantly silhouetted. At some time I must have fallen quite quietly asleep, for I recall a distinct sense of weaving strange dreams. When the cat started violently from his placid position, I saw him in the faint auroral glow. Head strained forward, 4 feet on my ankles, and hind feet stretched behind. He was looking intensely at a point on the wall, somewhat west of the window. point which to my eye had nothing to mark it, but toward which all my attention was now directed. And as I watched, I knew that Nigger Man was not vainly excited. Whether the arras was actually moved, I cannot say. I think it did, very slightly. But what I can swear to is that behind it I heard a low, distinct scurrying as of rats or mice. In a moment the cat had jumped bodily on the screening tapestry, bringing the affected section of the floor with his weight, and exposing a damp ancient wall of stone, patched here and there by the restorers and devoid of any trace of rodent prowlers. Nigger Man raced up and down the floor by this part of the wall, clawing the fallen arras and seemingly trying at times to insert a paw between the wall and the oaken floor. He found nothing, and after a time returned wearily to his place across my feet. I had not moved, but I did not sleep again that night. In the morning I questioned all the servants and found that none of them had noticed anything unusual, save for the cook remembered the actions of a cat which had rested on her windowsill. This cat had howled at some unknown hour of the night, awaking the cook in time for her to see him dart purposefully out of the open door down the stairs. And I drowsed away the noontime, and in the afternoon called him again on Captain Norris, who became exceedingly interested in what I told him. The odd incidents, so slight yet so curious, appealed to his sense of the picturesque, and elicited from him a number of reminiscences of local ghostly lore. We were genuinely perplexed at the presence of rats, and Norris lent me some traps and Paris screen, which I had the servants place in strategic localities when I returned. I retired early, being very sleepy, but was harassed by the dreams of the most horrible sort. I seemed to be looking down from an immense height upon a twilight grotto, knee-deep in filth, where a white-bearded demon swineherd drove me about with his staff, a flock of fungus, flabby beasts, whose appearance filled me with unutterable loathing. Then, as the swineherd paused and nodded over his task, a mighty swarm of rats rained down on the stinking abyss, and fell to devouring beasts and man alike. From this terrific vision I was abruptly awakened by the motions of Nigger Man, who had been sleeping as usual across my feet. This time I did not have to question the source of his snarls and hisses, and of the fear which had made him sink his claws into my ankle, unconscious of their effect, for on every side of the chamber the walls were alive with nauseous sound, the verminous slithering of ravenous gigantic rats. There was now no aurora to show the state of the arras, the fallen section of which had been replaced, but I was not too frightened to switch on the light. As the balls leaped into radiance, I saw its hideous shaking all over the tapestry. This motion disappeared almost at once, and the sound with it. Springing out of bed, I poked the arras with a long handle of a warming pan that rested near, and lifted one its section to see what lay beneath. There was nothing but the patched stone wall, and even the cat had lost its tense realization of abnormal presences. When I examined the circular trap that had been placed in the room, I found all the openings sprung, though no trace remained of what had been caught and escaped. Further sleep was out of the question, so lighting a candle, I opened the door and went out in the gallery toward the stairs to my study. Nigger Man followed me at my heels. Before we had reached the stone steps, however, the cat darted ahead of me and vanished down into ancient flight. As I descended the stairs myself, I became suddenly aware of sounds in the great room below, sounds of a nature which could not be mistaken. The oak-paneled walls were alive with rats, scampering and milling, whilst Nigger Man was racing about with the fury of a baffled hunter. Reaching the bottom, I switched on the light, which did not this time cause the noise to subside. The rats continued their riot, stampeding with such force and distinctness that I could finally assign their motions a definite direction. These creatures, in numbers apparently inexhaustible, were engaged in one stupendous migration from inconceivable heights to some depths, conceivably or inconceivably below. I now heard steps on the corridor, and in a moment, two servants pushed open the massive door. They were searching the house for some unknown source of disturbance which had caused thrown all the cats into a snarling panic.